Hello everyone. Today we are going to start with the first thinker in this course, Plato, and on Plato we are going to have 3 lectures, and today is part 1 of that 3 lecture, where we are going to discuss briefly the bio sketch or life sketch of Plato, his interest in philosophy, by situating him in the context of Greek city states, particularly during the classical period when knowledge about philosophy, medicine, science and mathematics was flourishing, and in that context how Plato contribute in the development of moral political philosophy, and also the influence of Socrates. And in the second part of this lecture today we are going to discuss his notion of justice. So, this is the first part where we are going to discuss brief bio sketch of Plato by situating him in the context of Socrates and Greek city states in the classic times, and in the second part we are going to discuss his notion of justice before concluding this lecture today. In the second part of Plato, that means the second lecture on Plato, we are going to particularly engage with his idea of philosopher king and the ideal state, and how he subsequently developed his conception of second best state. And in the final and the concluding lecture on Plato, we will engage with his idea of communism of wives and property, and finally assessing the contribution of Plato in political philosophy or in understanding the political problems, and we will have a kind of critical assessment of the overall argumentation of Plato and his contribution to Western political thought. If we look at the contribution and the role of Plato, he is someone who is regarded as the inspiring figure of many generation of political thinkers and philosophers in Western tradition, and in many tradition, particularly in Arab and also other tradition of political thinking and theorization, Plato is regarded as the first philosopher. His name is also equated with those who wonders or contemplates or speculates. So, Plato is someone who is regarded as synonymous with philosophy. So, it is usually regarded as the philosophy or political thought begins with Plato, and in this course particularly on these 3 lectures on Plato, we will see how he has towering presence and decisively shaped the discipline of political philosophy. So, it is regarded that the Western political thought or philosophy begins with Plato, and according to Ralph Waldo Emerson, that Plato is philosophy and philosophy is Plato, for out of Plato comes all things that are still written and debated among men of thought. So, I mean this statement by Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, clearly state the huge presence or significance of Plato's philosophy in the history of Western political thought and philosophy. So, all the things that we discuss today and that have been discussed since Platonic times, you will find its expression in his dialogues, in many of the dialogues that Plato has written. So, for all kind of moral, ethical, political problems that we face, one can find its expression in many of the dialogues that Plato has written, and therefore, correctly Emerson characterized philosophy as synonymous with Plato. So, Plato is philosophy and philosophy is Plato. And similarly, Whitehead has said that entire tradition of European philosophy is nothing but a series of footnotes to Plato and Aristotle. So, Aristotle is the next thinker we are going to do, but these two thinkers have a kind of significant influence in the evolution of political thought, political philosophy in Western tradition, and all the thinkers after them, be it Kant, Hobbes, Machiavelli, Rousseau, you will find that they did extend the paradigm of understanding the politics in their own way, but the streak of thought that guides their philosophy and political thinking has its expression in the writings of Plato and Aristotle. So, truly no thinker before and since has influenced the discipline of philosophy so much as Plato and Aristotle have done. So, these two thinkers have a very decisive role in shaping the discourse or the discipline of political philosophy, particularly in Western tradition. And this is also a point which I have discussed in the introductory lecture, that modern West rediscovery of Aristotle and Plato was through their translation in Arabic, and from Arabic they translated it back into the English. So, Plato has influence across the tradition, similarly Aristotle, and these two thinkers are said to have decisive influence in shaping the discipline of Western political thought or political philosophy. However, there is one more thinker who you have often come across, but who has not written, he has not left anything in writing, that is the Socrates. And Plato was deeply influenced by Socrates, and about that we will discuss in a minute. So, let us come back to use and the way Plato used philosophy, not just as a kind of contemplative or speculative exercise. So, often in the positivist paradigm of 20th century, it was regarded that political thought and philosophy is something merely the speculation and the contemplation done by few individuals, which has very little application in the practical pragmatic life of an individual and community, and we should not worry about reading or studying who said what when, and the reason being that it has very little application in solving many of the contemporary political, pragmatic, practical challenges. And therefore, there was this system theory or structuralist theory. However, the significance of political thought, as we have discussed in the introductory lecture, is there in not just providing the concepts and the ideas that we use to discuss about the politics, but also the methodology, the epistemology to understand the political phenomena. And the task of political philosophy then is not just to speculate and contemplate about the political problem, but also provide the solution for many of the challenges that we face in the politics. And as we know that in the politics, the challenges that we face is ethical or the moral challenges, ethical or the moral dilemma. So, what is justice? As we are going to discuss in this lecture, we will find that how moral questions are involved in defining what is justice, what is just order, how to lead a good life, and these questions require the role of political philosophy to determine. And so, for Plato, philosophy was not merely a contemplative or a speculative exercise, but something which had practical application to, such as in maintaining justice and order in the state. So, for many political philosophers or political thinkers and political theorists even today, one of the central concern is to how to create a society which would be just society, or an order which will enable the individual to realize his and her true potentialities. And answer to this question requires answering the many moral and ethical questions that is involved. So, for Plato, political philosophy is a tool, or philosophy is a to help in ensuring or maintaining justice and order in the state and society, and thereby for communities when they manage their common affair, for a very long time we use some other kind of authority as well. For example, we use the divine authority or the some kind of metaphysical or transcendental entity to understand our own practical real world. For the first time through Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, we began to use our own reason and intellect to understand many of the moral, political problem or ethical problem that we face. And while arguing about this moral ethical problem by using one's own intellect lead to different kind of political philosophy and theorization about the political philosophy. So, we study these political philosophers and their contribution is to give the individual the right or the authority to decide for themselves what is good and what is desirable, how to lead a good life. And for leading a good life, they do not have to rely on some other authority than themselves, and this we see in Plato, when we do Immanuel Kant and many other thinkers as well. For them, then the philosophy is not just in a speculative or contemplative exercise, but it has deep influence in shaping the order, the moral dilemmas that we face in the practical pragmatic life. So, for Plato particularly, his interest in philosophy was developed, and the value that he learned, that philosophy also help one to lead a good moral and virtuous life. So, we all seek happiness, but what is the true basis for leading a happy life? So, there could be many answers to that, and this is necessarily an ethical question, vary from person to person about his or her subjective choices. But to lead a true happy life requires, according to Plato, Socrates and others philosophers that we are going to do, a kind of examined life, that is, we decide for ourselves using our own intellect that what is good for us, and determining what is good requires the use of logic, use of reason and intellect, and they agree that to lead a happy life one need to lead a moral life or virtuous life. And what is virtuous? When you have the knowledge of what is virtue, and how you are going to acquire that knowledge, it is through the reflection, through contemplation, and that is the role of philosophy, which shows you what is really happiness. So, sometimes you do something, but after doing that you do not realize that you are happy, actually you are satisfied. So, this question of happiness or a satisfied life require moral contemplation, moral thinking, or the understanding of the virtue. And these thinkers, Socrates, Plato and Aristotle and many others that we are going to do, will argue that philosophy help us not just understanding the world as it is, but also as an individual to lead a moral, virtuous, dignified life, and this Plato learned from Socrates. And his contribution, Plato's contribution, if you talk about, is in the all branches of philosophy. So, from logic to ethics, aesthetics to politics and metaphysics. And he also shaped the philosophy of language, philosophy of beauty, philosophy of education and so on. And therefore, Plato, since he has left us with a lot of writings and dialogue through which we can not just understand the Greek city states or the political arrangements in the polis, and many ethical problems that is involved in governing the collective life of a community, but also it help us to develop our own epistemology, our own logic to understand something. So, it is not just the appearance. So, for most of us in our life or in our interpersonal relationship, we are guided by the appearance or our instant responses to those surroundings, be it individual or the social political events that is happening. But the political philosophy require us to see beyond the appearance, to understand the underlying assumptions, beliefs and dogmas, and then judge accordingly. So, the political philosophy has a very significant role in understanding the political phenomena or life beyond the appearance. What is the underlying harmonious principles that govern life, that shape the political events. So, the engagement with the writings, and I will encourage you to read these classic writings or dialogues, particularly Gorgias by Plato. So, these reading or engagement with will help us to critically reflect our own biases, preferences and suppositions. So, Plato is therefore the greatest philosopher ever, and his Republic, which is the magnum opus, which is considered the most important and the first book of political philosophy. In this text, he engages with the question of what is justice and how to have a just order in a polity. And as the polity we see today, there is multiple opinions or many factions having different views, different solution to the common problem that we face. So was the case when Plato was writing. And political philosophy and the role of political philosophy is to provide that stable order which will enable the individual and community to realize its true potentialities. And therefore, for Plato, the question of justice was very significant or the central concern. He also discussed in this text, which we are going to discuss in next two lecture, the idea of philosopher king or the ideal state, the ideal system of education, the communism of wives and property. So, all these topics are dealt with by Plato in his text Republic. Now, to understand the political thought of Plato, it is also perhaps necessary to understand the socio-political context of Plato, that was the Greek city states in the classic period, and the classic period of Greek city state is roughly between 480 to 380 BC. This period provided the most conducive condition for the philosophy to flourish. So, remember the political thought and philosophy emerge out of intense and politically unstable times. So, and there was a kind of self-governing autonomous city states, and that was moving towards a bigger empire. And during this flux of self-sufficient autonomous city states and the coming of empire, Plato, Aristotle and Socrates was developing their conception of ideal state, good life, how to realize the true potentiality, how to ensure justice in the city, which would enable the individual to realize his true potentiality. So, the classical period in Greek city states provided that conducive environment for the thought and philosophy and the lofty imagination of the thinkers or philosopher to flourish. And in this period, men also began to subject their knowledge about the world, that is the phenomena that constitute the world. It may be a natural phenomena or it may also be like individual soul. What is the source of that soul, how to realize the true potentialities of the soul and so on. So, during this classical period in the Greek city states, men for the first time began to subject their knowledge of world and also themselves to the reason. So, the reason or the intellect was used as the only source of knowledge about the world and the individual self also. And if you recall that many society and community do have the knowledge about themselves or the soul or the world phenomena, and the basis of those knowledge is say some religious treatise or some religious expression, although those came back again during the medieval time as we discussed. But in classical Greek city states time, for the first time men took this audacious task of basing their knowledge of the world and individual on the basis of their own reason and the intellect. So, we will see that how the reason and the rational inquiry becomes the basis of all form of knowledge, and it influenced many other disciplines as well, not just the political philosophy. So, there were all round development in philosophy, science, mathematics, geography, history and medicine. So, in the Western tradition, the classical period in the Greek city state is also seen as a period when there was all round development in many disciplines, including philosophy, science, mathematics, geography, medicine, history and so on. The relative and what provided that conducive environment was the relative autonomy, self-sufficiency and a degree of prosperity of the small compact city states was the ideal condition for all these disciplines of philosophy to flourish, to have new modes of knowledge or new knowledge about the world in which human being live and realize their potentialities. So, these relative autonomy, self-sufficiency and a degree of prosperity in the very compact nature of these Greek city states provided these thinkers or philosophers the ideal condition for their speculation and contemplation and basing the knowledge of themselves or the society or polity on the intellect. This is also a point to note that in the Greek city states all the productive manual work was done by the slaves, and this freedom from productive manual work enabled these thinkers, philosophers to contemplate and think about the larger goods or the higher order principles, so to say, to think about the basis of morality and ethics, not on some other authority than the reason or human intellect. So, the zenith of this classical period was in the philosophy of Socrates, Plato and Aristotle. We will discuss Socrates before we enter into the life world of Plato, but Aristotle we are going to do in the next topics. So, in the Greek city states broadly then emerged the two branches of philosophy or knowledge system. One was about the pursuit of natural and the measurable world. So, you know, in the Greek times also there was the best treatises written on mathematics or history or medicine and so on. And Aristotle also wrote about biology and other scientific stuff as well. So, one branch of knowledge or philosophy was about the natural world, which could be measured, which could be calculated. So, that leads to the natural philosophy. The Socrates was the one, and then Plato and Aristotle and many others who thought that it is not just enough to think about and reflect upon the natural world or the measurable thing. It is equally necessary to understand the moral philosophy that deals with the question of life, soul, good conduct, beauty, happiness, truth and the ideal state. So, that leads to the growth and development of moral philosophy in the classical period in the Greek city states. And also in the Greek city states you have all kinds of government, from oligarchy to autocracy, from aristocracy to democracy. You have all kind of government that existed during the Greek city states. And Athens, to which Plato belonged, was a kind of flourishing town with the plurality of beliefs and cultures, and it took pride in the democracy, and it was a kind of achievement that no longer we rely on few individual or a group of individual to govern our common affair. So, the Athenian was a kind of system where everyone, every citizen took part in the management of the common affairs of their society or their community. So, for the Athenian, democracy and democratic method of governing was something they took excessive pride in, and every citizen was participating in turn in the ruling and being ruled in turn, as Aristotle said. So, they all took active interest in the matters of politics. It was not like today, when we talk about the politics, we leave it to the political parties and politicians to decide. So, politics is something which governs every sphere of our life, and we should all be aware of, take interest in or participate in the political process in the country and society to govern it better, to make it more representative, to make it more just or transparent or accountable. An Athenian system of government, where everybody was part of the process of governance, was something which was regarded as an ideal, although in the Sparta, which was ruled by the aristocracy, was the opposite. And similarly, there were other kinds of government as well, as I said, oligarchy, autocracy and so on. So, and if you look at the political institution in Athens, that is ecclesia, that was the assembly where all the debates related to the political matters were being conducted, and there was well enumerated rules for taking part in the discussion and debates, and all the decisions was taken by this assembly. So, it could be synonymous to our modern day parliament or the legislative assembly, which deliberates upon the laws, and laws are the basis of government or the rule in today's democracies as well. Then there was the ball, which was the council, and it was in a body which was in the permanent session. As and when the needs arise, they used to implement the decision and set the agenda for the assembly, as it is done by the executive organs of the modern state and liberal democracy. And there was then dicasteria, that was the courts to adjudicate the matters that was related to state laws and government. And besides that, there was the 10 influential magistrates, which was called strategoi. So, these were the political institutional framework of Athenian democracy, which roughly represent the kind of organs or the system that we have in modern nation states, which we distinguish between 3 organs chiefly, that is the executive, legislative and the judiciary. And similarly, you have in that classical period Athens, among the Greek city states, which was governed by oligarchy, aristocracy, autocracy. You have the Athenian example where they governed themselves through democracy, through the clear separation of power, by ensuring the accountability of those who are in the business of governing, and everybody was taking interest or participating in managing the collective affairs of their community. So, that was a kind of shining example of democracy. However, if we study the sociological basis of Athenian democracy, we will find that the majority of slaves or women and residents alien were excluded from the citizenship and had no right to participate in the affairs of the polis. So, it was a kind of very limited sense, but it provided the opportunity for the individual to think about how to ensure order, justice, how to govern oneself better, and in governing the collective affairs of the society, how it ensure the uh, true realization or the full realization of individual potentiality, and that is something which concerned uh, the philosopher like Socrates or Plato, which we will discuss in a minute. Now, before discussing Plato, it is necessary to understand how Socrates influenced the youths in Athens and had great influence in the political thinking of Plato as well. And for the first time in Socrates, we see the use of philosophy as not something which we should confine to writing. He was someone who wanted to engage with the other individual, and in that engagement through dialogue, through cross examination, he wanted to develop the knowledge, and that knowledge then lead to refinement of individual and also the community. And we will see that how this new approach created a lot of challenges for particularly the oligarchs or those who are in the business of governing. Now, Socrates, which time period was 470 BC to 399 BC, was the first philosopher who was poisoned, forced to take poison because of his thought, because of his engagement with the philosophy. So, he was the first kind of martyr of this discipline, and we will see why it happened and in what context and what influence it had on the minds of Plato and Aristotle and many other philosophers. So, the basis of Socrates is this maxim that all forms of knowledge and philosophy should be based on this idea that we know nothing, and from this knowing nothing, most of the time you come across the people groups claiming that they have all the answer, but that answer is unexamined answer. That may be your beliefs, your maybe biases, maybe the preferences, and you regard these preferences, biases, prejudices as your thought. So, for Socrates, for the first time, all kinds of ideas, all kind of knowledge about truth, life, polity, state, citizenship, right, should be subjected to critical scrutiny, and the starting point should be that we know nothing. So, this quote, that one thing only I know, and that is that I know nothing. So, the claim for a philosopher and those who seek the true answer of questions like what is justice, what is good life, what is truth, what is beauty, what is ultimate reality, should start with questioning one's own presumptions and one's own belief, and that is the role of Socrates. And he believed that the philosophers should not confine their role to the writings, but engage with the other individuals, other groups, and he used to travel freely across the Athens, sit in the market, in someone's home, and start reflecting, questioning about these ideas of truth, beauty, and so on. So, the axiom that I know nothing gives us the new approach to the knowledge, that is through constant reasoning, through use of human reason, not because some scriptures, some beliefs or the social customs or conventions tells us to do so. So, the authority of any knowledge is not on the basis of some other authority than human reason or human intellect, and that shaped great many youths in the Athens, including Plato. So, knowledge for Socrates is then a relentless pursuit through rational or logical cross examination and doubting. The way knowledge progress or understanding develop is through cross examination, through use of logic and doubting all kind of definition, conventions, beliefs, prejudices that we may have to have the pure knowledge about a phenomena, about something. And we can also understand our own biases, prejudices and so on, which colors our thought. So, often we equate our bias with the thought, but thought requires a kind of constant cross examination of our own beliefs and preferences. So, this method of Socrates is called elenchus, which influenced the uh, uh, thought and philosophy of many thinkers including Plato. And he argued that our knowledge should be product of cross examining our cherished belief, dogmas or axioms. So, as a human being, part of a culture or a society or a linguistic tradition, we carry certain biases which comes because of our social life or because of our socialization, and it often colors our understanding, our thought. Socrates tells us that we need to examine those beliefs, those biases critically to have true knowledge about something. So, for Socrates, knowing thyself, that is in Greek gnoti Satan, was the basis of all knowledge. And unfortunately, we know very little about Socrates. As I told you that he was someone who believed that the true philosopher should engage with a dialogue with the other individual, and in that process of dialogue our beliefs, our cherished ideals are cross examined and the true knowledge developed, not through writing a text and so on. So, we have very little knowledge about Socrates, except the account of his life and teachings that is there in Plato's writing. So, Socrates is the main protagonist in all of Plato's dialogue, and that shows the significance of Socrates' thought and his modes of inquiry on Plato. So, in all of his dialogues, and dialogues is the text that Plato has written. So, most notable dialogues are Republic or Gorgias, but in other dialogues too, which is Plato's writing, you have Socrates as the main protagonist. So, Plato is speak to us through Socrates, and Socrates was the one who started this new approach to producing knowledge, to understanding something through rational, logical cross examination in a dialogical form. And he lived, that is Socrates lived like a free thinker, searching after the true meaning of happiness, beauty and truth. And in Greek city states, Socrates was the one who realized the value of moral philosophy, and not just the philosophy about the natural measurable world. And how you are going to then measure the value of human life or human soul, what is truth, what is beauty, and these are the moral problems which requires the moral philosophy and a kind of dialogical engagement with the prevailing notions of truth, beauty, justice and so on. So, to answer these questions, he subjected all notions of truth, beauty, good life and soul to the ruthless critical scrutiny through rational argumentation, and Greek believed in the four cardinal virtue. So, to have some kind of order in the society, and the Greeks believed that individuals should have these four cardinal virtue, and these virtues are courage, wisdom, justice and temperance. Temperance is a kind of moderation, not the extreme of any elements in human personality, emotion and other things. So, these four cardinal virtues was the basis for human life, which could be a life worth living for or to have a social order. Now, Socrates believed that all these virtues are interconnected and there is only one virtue, and the Greek word for virtue is arete, and he believes in this axiom that all human beings seek happiness. So, all our actions are guided by realizing the happiness. But what kind of life is happy life? And to answer that, he believed that a virtuous life is happy life. And what is virtuous is the knowledge of virtue. So, to live a virtuous life, one need to have the knowledge of virtue, or knowledge is virtue for Socrates, and there is a kind of unity of virtue. So, if one is courageous, then he will be wise enough to know his role and act according to that knowledge. And once the individual who is courageous act according to his knowledge, his life is worth living for, or a virtuous life. And virtuous life requires the knowledge of virtue, and how you acquire this knowledge is through dialogue with others, not just being happy with whatever you think or cherish as the true or true meaning of anything, or true virtue. So, dialogic life is something which help us in understanding or having the knowledge about virtue, and then shaping our life according to that, and that life which is virtuous life is the only source of happy life according to Socrates, and that is the role of knowledge and philosophy in leading a happy life, which is called eudaimonia. So, because of this thinking and this new approach to knowledge and philosophy, he was poisoned by the democratic rulers of Athens in 399 on the charges of impiety, that is showing suspicion to all kinds of authority and also corrupting the youth. So, the democratic rulers in Athens believed that Socrates, through his teaching, and as I said that he used to sit in very informal gatherings at the marketplace or in the friend's place, and beginning this relentless questioning about what is the true nature of human soul, right conduct, or beauty, or truth, and so on. And these democratic rulers thought corrupts the youth and make them suspicious to all forms of authority, and thought that is dangerous to the stability and the order that is there in Athens, and they thought that Socrates should die. And Plato provided a very fascinating account of Socrates' life and trials in Apology and Crito. So, he was regarded as the wisest man, first to begin subjecting all forms of knowledge to human reason and intellect. However, the governors or the rulers of the day thought that he encourages among the youth suspicion to authority, and therefore dangerous to the political rule or the political stability, and corrupts the youth, and therefore he should die. However, he was also regarded as the wisest man in Athens, who shaped the political thinking of the whole generation, including Plato. And Plato, therefore, since Socrates were forced to drink poison by the democratic rule, was apprehensive and suspicious to the democratic rule, which he equated to mobocracy or crowd rule, driven by instinct rather than reason. And Socrates' method of knowledge or dialogue has deep influence on the thought or philosophical inquiry that Plato had. Now, if you turn to Plato, his period is from 427 BC to 347 BC, and he was born into an aristocratic family in Athens. When a generation long Peloponnesian war between 430 BC to 404 BC was taking place between Athens and Sparta, and the struggle is also between the two modes of governing. Athens was ruled by the democracy and Sparta was ruled by the aristocracy. So, politically it was a turbulent times in Athens, and Athenians took pride, as I said, in their democracy, but there was growing strife and hostilities between two factions one was oligarchic and other was democratic, and Plato has political connections with both these factions, democratic and oligarchic. Sparta, ruled by aristocracy, finally defeated the Athens in this war, and oligarchic factions blamed it to ineptness of democratic rule in Athens. Plato was anguished by this turbulent politics in Athens, and he thought that philosophy, and that is the pragmatic use of philosophy, will provide a sound foundation for ethical conduct for individual and also for the rulers. So, uh, in Plato's time there was a growing tension or strife between these two factions, and there was a kind of instability about what is just order and what is the true notion of justice, and through philosophy he was trying to provide that ethical answer, not just the religious and other forms of authority, but using human reason and intellect to provide ethical solution to the political ethical challenges that Athens was grappling with during his time. So, power in Athens used to alternate between oligarchs and democrats, and when the rule of 30 was inserted with the tacit support from Sparta, Plato was invited to join, but he refused because he thought that philosophy is the better way to understand the moral challenges of his time and not really the active politics. So, soon this rule of 30 tyrants were replaced by democracy again, and therefore, the constant alternation of power between oligarchs and the democrats was happening in Athens. So, the political instability and the moral decay in Athens deeply anguished Plato, and he confessed it in the autobiographical writings, which is 7th letter, and thought that the only hope of finding justice for society or for individual lay in true philosophy. So, the role of true philosophy is not just speculation and contemplation, but to provide justice in the society or just order in the society, which would be just for individual as well, and that mankind will have no respite from trouble until either real philosophers gain political power or politicians become by some miracle true philosopher. So, that is the basis of his idea of philosopher king, which we are going to discuss in the next lecture. But here at this point we have to understand the political context of instability and moral decay enables Plato to reflect upon the moral and the ethical challenges that Athens was facing, and he thought that philosophy has a significant role to play in answering those moral and ethical problems, and he thought that until the philosopher becomes the king or king become the philosopher, there will be no end to the tyranny and moral decay that was there. After the death of Socrates, Plato undertook extensive travels to other city states in Greece, Italy and Egypt, and returned to Athens in 387 BC. He founded after the return an academy in the same year where both theoretical subjects as well as the practical subjects were taught. And one of the distinct feature of this academy was the knowledge of mathematics was regarded as prerequisite for admission into the academy. So, the philosophy and philosophical inquiry require the sound knowledge of mathematics. So, it is not a kind of speculation or contemplation for the sake of it, but it has a very sound methodological and epistemological basis for reflection and resolving many of the ethical and political challenges. Aristotle was taught in this academy by Plato, and Plato also made during his lifetime unsuccessful attempt to convert the tyrant of Syracuse. Syracuse was a small princely state in Italy, and Plato in his lifetime tried to convert the tyrant of Syracuse to become a philosopher rule, but this attempt was unsuccessful, and then he confined himself to the academy in teaching, writing his dialogues till the end of his life in 347 BC, and following his mentor Socrates, Plato too followed a dialogical method. So, all his political argumentation and political inquiry progressed through dialogue by engaging with the other prevailing notions before giving his own account of justice or state and so on. So, if you look at the works of Plato, it is divided into 4 categories: Apology, Crito, Euthyphro, Laches are his early works. Gorgias, Meno, Protagoras is regarded as the transitional work of Plato, and Phaedo, Symposium, Republic, Phaedrus and Parmenides, and Theaetetus as the middle work of Plato, and Timaeus, Sophist, Statesman, Philebus, Laws, and 7th later as the late work. So, these are the classification of Plato's work in the 4 category from early, middle, transitional, middle and the late works. However, Republic is regarded as the magnum opus of Plato, where he discussed his ideal state, and Laws and Statesmen are his other political works, where he discusses the nature and characteristic of the second beast state. Now, if you look at his conception of justice, where as I have said that the whole of the purpose in Republic is to answer this question, what is justice, and Plato regarded justice as the first order principle of a state. So, any order, any state cannot be stable, cannot be helpful for its governed unless that order, that state is just. And he argued that without justice there could not be order or stability or happiness either for the individual and for the state. So, to have order, stability and happiness, he thought that the justice should be the foundation of the polity, and justice according to Plato therefore was the sine qua non, that absolute necessity for order and stability in the state. And the Republic in a way is answer to this question, what is justice. However, like his tutor Socrates, before providing his own account of justice, Plato engages with many prevailing notions of justice through the notable scholars and sophists in Athens. So, first he refute all the prevailing notions of justice which was held in his time by through the notable scholars and the sophist philosopher. He present those prevailing notions and then goes on to provide his notion of justice. So, first to join this debate on what is justice is Cephalus, who argued that justice is being honest, speaking the truth and paying one's debts. So, according to Cephalus, if an individual is honest and speaks truth and pays the debts that he owes to others, that is justice. Plato, who speaks through Socrates, refute this argument and often and argues that often speaking truth or being honest or paying debts to the other leads to unjust consequences or undesirable consequences. So, if speaking truth or being honest or paying debts leads to undesirable or unjust consequences or harmful consequences for the self and also for the other, how that could be just, how that principle could be regarded as the just principle. So, let us take the example Suppose you owe someone a knife and that person has become mad. Now, if this principle of justice is applied, then you should give knife to that person, but that person has now become mad, may harm himself or others. So, can we say that paying the debt is just? So, Plato refute this argument, this definition of justice, that being honest, speaking truth and paying one's debt is just. Then Polemarchus defines justice as doing good to one's friends and harms to enemies. So, if one do good to his friends and harms to his enemy, then that is justice. So, any action or any act of individual which helps his friend and harms the enemy is just. So, it is a very practical pragmatic understanding of justice. So, you help your friend and harm your enemy. However, Plato refute this definition of justice by asserting that in life it is very hard to distinguish who is your real friend and who is your enemy. You may have friends in the guise of enemy or vice versa, an enemy in or a friend in the guise of enemy or an enemy in the guise of friend. So, besides that, harming others cannot be the basis of just order, because it harms further those whom any harm is already done. Let us take it this way. So, if we regard justice as doing harm to other, then we deny that other their true potentiality or what is their true nature. Now, justice as a principle, and through this modes of inquiry, Plato was trying to have the absolute notion of justice, which would be the harmonious existence that we will discuss later. So, as a principle, first he refute this definition of justice as doing good to your friend and harm to your enemy, by stating it is very hard to distinguish between real friend and enemy. And secondly, you cannot do harm to do justice. So, justice requires the harmonious existence of everyone, no distinguishing between the individual by supporting or awarding one and punishing the other. So, justice as a system requires where everyone flourishes, everyone realize his or her true potentiality. So, this definition of justice he also refute. Then next is sophist, was those philosophers who were regarded as the supporter of the practical morality, who refuted all kind of abstract or conventional conservative ideals or authority. So, Thrasymachus was a sophist and who argued that justice is the advantage of the stronger, and justice, if you like, so in any society and any state, the justice which is following the law, abiding by the law, is framed in a way which helps the stronger or the ruler. So, Thrasymachus argued that justice is always the advantage of the stronger. So, it is better to be unjust if you get away with that. And these modes of thinking you may also find when we will discuss Marx's idea of false ideology, where workers or the majority of the individual follow the ideology of those who ruled over them, those who exploit them. And Thrasymachus similarly argued that justice or laws are something which benefit the stronger or the ruler. So, it is better to be unjust. So, injustice is more desirable than justice. However, Plato refuted this argument too by asserting that injustice could not be better than justice if a ruler act as a ruler. So, he philosophically argue with Thrasymachus that if a ruler frame the law to suit his own interest, then he is not behaving as a ruler. So, the condition for Plato is that a ruler must act as a ruler, and if he acts as a ruler, he must act in for the benefit of the subject or for the citizen. So, when a ruler frame a law for his own selfish interest, he is not actually working or functioning as a ruler. So, a true ruler will always act for the benefit of his citizen and subject, and if he does so, then how can we argue that injustice is preferable to justice, and justice could not be the in the true sense of the term for the benefit of the stronger. Next set of definition comes from Glaucon and Admetus, who argue that men are not intrinsically just, and they argue that the men are basically selfish and calculative. So, they will be just if it is for their benefit, and unjust if that injustice is for their benefit. Plato refute this argument too, and for him justice could not be governed by the cold calculation of rational self interest, and most often we do not know what is that self interest that leads to happiness in the life, and then proceed to provide his own conception of justice, which is good in itself. And this line of thought we will find in the Kantian ethics as well. So, for Plato, justice is not a means to some ends, justice is something which is good in itself. So, if we behave justly, if a society behave justly, he or she or society will realize his, her or their own potential or true potential, that is the root to happiness, to happy life. So, justice as a good or a desirable thing is good in itself, it does not require any further substantiation or further effects, as many scholars like Glaucon, Admetus and others have argued. Now, Plato presents his own conception of justice first in the city states and then at the level of individual. So, he argues, and there is no dichotomy, no differentiation between the justice for the individual and justice in the state at the larger level. So, first he provided his conception of justice at the level of city states or the polis, and his idea of polis was a kind of organic idea, it does not distinguish and differentiate between and among different organs of the state, which he divided into three classes, and these three classes were having three distinct qualities or skills or talents. So, there were farmers, traders, craftsmen driven by appetite or emotions or instinct. So, they are in the majority in any society or in any state. Then there was the auxiliary classes of military commanders or spirited who were guided by the honor. So, they were in the minority, and even in fewer numbers were those who were the philosophers guided by the reason. For them, trained in dialectics, the knowledge for the sake of knowledge, the wisdom is the true basis of happiness. So, for these three classes having different talents, farmers, traders, craftsmen, driven by their appetites, emotions and instinct were the producing classes. The auxiliary classes of military commanders driven by spirit or the courage or the sake of honor, and philosophers were driven by knowledge or the wisdom or the true wisdom, together constitute the guardian classes. So, for Plato, an ideal state would be when all the classes act or work according to their own talents. So, they realize their own potentialities by doing that for which they are best suitable to, And in doing one's own actions, one's own allotted work according to one's own nature, they realize justice, and also justice prevails and order prevails in the state. So, there is no conflict in the state or in the society, because producer needs protector, protector needs producer, and the philosopher is someone who guide the state through wisdom or through intellect or through reason, and that helps all the classes to realize their talents to the fullest. So, for Plato, in order to have just order and justice in the state, three classes must realize their interdependence. That means, producer needs protector to protect them from the external aggression, protector needs the producer to have their material needs satisfied, and both of them needs a philosopher king to lead them to the good action, to govern the state through reason or through intellect. And how a philosopher king helps in realizing the ideal state or just order in the state and realizing the true potential of individual, we are going to have a separate lecture on that. But for the justice to prevail in a state or a polity, for Plato, all the classes should act according to their own nature by realizing the interdependence or acknowledging these interdependence and work according to their own specific nature. Similarly, like in the city states, Plato identifies three elements of the individual soul, that is appetite at the base, then the spirit, and finally the intellect. And injustice or conflict happens when our emotions are against our intellect. So, within the human soul or individual personality, Plato argue that to have harmonious or just life, individual must subordinate appetite and spirit to human reason or intellect. So, at the level of individual, justice or order or stability is obtained when our appetites and spirit are subjected to our intellect and reason. Similarly, at the city states or at the state level, the philosopher king should govern the auxiliary classes, and the producing classes do what they are best suited to do, realizing their interdependence and not conflict. So, his conception of classes is not the Marxist or other exploitative notion of classes, where Plato's conception of classes is that men are by nature, by psyche, fit to do certain things, and doing that thing brings happiness, harmony to their existence. And when city states or polity provide the condition for realizing one's own true self, that order is just. So, there is no conflict. So, harmony and stability is the basis of Platonic conception of justice. So, Platonic conception of justice is based on the harmony of existence, not the conflict that we find when we discuss about justice in contemporary times. So, harmony of existence is for both individual. Within individual, you have these three elements of appetites, spirit and reason. To lead a happy harmonious life, one need to have the harmony between these three by subordinating appetite and spirit to human reason and intellect, and similarly among the three classes in the states. So, when they act and do things which they are best suitable without interfering in other works, then alone justice could be achieved and order achieved in the state. So, it is based on this twin principle of interdependence and specialization. So, it is a kind of coherence existence among the classes and also within the individual self, realizing the value of interdependence or the specialization of one's talent. So, to conclude this lecture on Plato's conception of justice, which one needs to acknowledge is rooted in the harmony of existence, within the self or the soul of the individual and also among the three classes in the state. And justice is vital, this harmony of existence is vital for order within the human soul or within the state, and it is essential to achieve the full potentialities of the individual as well as the state. And justice is a primary moral value and intrinsically connected to the other moral values such as courage, wisdom and temperance, which was the guiding principle of Greek society. So, Platonic conception of justice can be argued as the organic conception of justice. There is a kind of coherence within the individual three core elements of appetite, spirit and intellect, and also among the three classes in the state. So, he argued that as an individual where reason or intellect must guide the spirited and the appetitive part of the soul, similarly the philosopher should guide the auxiliary and trading classes in the state. So, justice is achieved when each individuals or classes act and work according to their nature without interfering with the others. So, for the harmonious existence in the state, Plato argued that all the individual and all the classes should act according to their own nature, to realize their own talents without interfering with others. So, injustice in the state happens when say trading class take the role of philosophers, or when the producing class take the role of military commanders or the auxiliary classes. So, all these classes has mutual role to play, and through interdependence of their performance or their role, the order and justice is restored or established in the state, and that justice and order help them realize their own true potentiality. So, there is a kind of harmonious or a coherence that exists within the individual self among the three core elements and also in the state among the three classes, and that is how we can look at Platonian conception of justice. However, for many Plato's theory of justice could appear as inegalitarian, as it differentiate among the men on the basis of their talents and also divide them into the classes, and this division of classes is vertical. So, there are majority of people who are traders, craftsmen, farmers, they are at the base. Then there are the guardian classes of military commanders and the philosopher, and they perform different roles. So, for many in contemporary times, his conception of justice could appear as inegalitarian conception of justice. And second, it regards that the individual could be talented in only one skill, but in our pragmatic life we may find one individual having talent in more than one skill. So, a farmer could be also a good soldier or vice versa, or a philosopher could be also a good soldier. However, in Platonian conception of justice there is only one skill to which individuals should subscribe to or govern his life, and it is equally true to the classes. Many scholars have also criticized Platonic conception which argue that the action of individual is driven by reason. They argue that reason help us to understand the real nature of the phenomena, but to act upon those requires the role of emotions or other stimulations, and reason itself is not the sufficient ground for acting upon our own understanding. So, those are the obvious limits and criticism to Platonic conception of justice. However, his conception of justice continue to inspire many generations of political thinkers and philosophers, and it remains the central concern in political philosophy. So, that is what I thought of sharing with you on Platonic conception of justice, and on this you can refer to these texts like David Butcher and Paul Kelly, political thinkers from Socrates to the present. Then Will Durant has a very good chapter on the contribution of Plato to political thought and political philosophy. We can also look at Murray, Forsyth and Moriskin's Soper, A Guide to Political Classic, Plato to Rousseau. Similarly, Cephalagia, Western political thought from the ancient Greeks to modern times, gives a good introduction to the Greek city states and also role of Socrates and his contribution, philosophy and shaping the minds like Plato and other youths in Athens. You can also refer to J.S. McClelland, A History of Western Political Thought, and also Nelson, Western Political Thought, and James Allen Wren on Politics, A History of Political Thought from Herodotus to the present. So, these are some of the texts you can refer to understand more about Plato and his context and also his conception of justice. So, do share your comments and feedbacks. Thanks for your patience and listening. Thank you all.